Olá pessoal, trago para vocês hoje entrevista com o maior ufólogo australiano. Vamos conhecer casos fantásticos ocorridos lá na Oceania. Você sabia que ele investigou um caso onde cabelos de anjo foram recuperados? Sim, tudo isso e muito mais em mais uma entrevista inédita e exclusiva que você só encontra aqui no canal Desvendando Mistérios. Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, boa madrugada, aonde você estiver, no Brasil ou na Austrália. Sejam bem-vindos ao canal Desvendando Mistérios. E hoje trago para vocês mais uma entrevista inédita e exclusiva com o maior ufólogo australiano, Bill Shawker. Ele vai trazer para a gente casos incríveis, os casos de West Hall, o do piloto Valentis Frenderis, a abdução, desaparecimento, acidente trágico. Ele vai falar também de um caso que ocorreu na Austrália, onde uma substância foi expelida por um OVNI. Essa substância é conhecida como cabelos de anjo. Vem comigo então, nessa entrevista incrível que vai mostrar para mim e para você um pouco mais da casuística nesse enorme país que é a Austrália. Você que gosta do conteúdo do canal, dá uma força, vamos lá, vamos chegar a 20 mil inscritos até o final do ano. Não deixe de se inscrever no canal, marque também o sininho para sempre que tiver um vídeo novo, você será avisado. Não deixe também de dar um like em todos os mais de 400 vídeos do canal. E também a sua opinião nos comentários de todos os vídeos. Escreva lá, eu vou te responder. Vamos então para essa entrevista com Bill Shawker, o maior ufólogo australiano.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for being here and for accepting my invitation. I am sure the Brazilian audience is gonna love it because we always want to know what happens in Australia, because there are fabulous and amazing cases in Australia. So it's a great opportunity to us to learn a lot more about the UFO phenomena in Australia and about yourself. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Well, I will start with the same question that I make for all my guests. What led you to the UFO research?
Well, I guess for me, it started off as a young teenager. I had an interest in the unexplained and science and that kind of thing. And I sort of grew up in the as a mid-60s kind of 1960s young teenager, and it just so happened that my local area of in Australia, on the north coast of New South Wales, our most populous state, was the centre of a lot of UFO activity during 1966, and my hometown actually was the focus of a bit of UFO activity. Local police were chasing UFOs during 1966, and I wasn't lucky enough to have a sighting back then in 1966, but it kind of twigged an interest in me, and I started to study it fairly extensively, mostly through reading and that kind of thing to begin with. And at the local high school, there was a whole selection of the popular science, popular mechanics, science and mechanics, those kind of magazines from the States that were featuring a lot of UFO articles. This was at the time when the so-called Condon Committee was starting to come into play, and it was being seen initially as a legitimate scientific inquiry into the UFO subject. And so as a young teenager, that got me interested. But as we all know by now, the Condon Committee was not exactly your ideal scientific study of UFOs. It kind of led to the shutting down of the US Air Force Project Blue Book, and became a bit of a controversial study. It was kind of a politicised kind of project, really, to allow the United States Air Force to diplomatically get out of the UFO game, so to speak. But it never really got out of the game, so we know that for a fact anyway.
That's great. But Bill, how's the UFO activity nowadays in Australia? Do we have some recent case? Do we have some kind of case that you think, well, this is huge?
Well, there's always the problem at the moment, and it's kind of a worldwide phenomenon as well, is that most of the UFO reporting that goes on is somewhat underground, simply because a lot of people have had to put up with decades of ridicule and that kind of thing, and therefore there's a lot of kind of less public kind of ways of reporting UFO activity and UFO experiences, that kind of thing. And so that's the kind of thing that happens big time here in Australia at the moment, that most people report their sightings to non-government organisations and private UFO groups, that kind of thing. I guess the main interest at the moment has been the, high profiling of the UFO subject here through two particular things. And that is we've got a local investigative journalist, quite a high profile investigative journalist by the name of Ross Coulthard, who I've known for many years. And he's had a book published in, I think, June this year. It's called In Plain Sight. And just for your people there, that's the book. Highly recommended. And what he's done is essentially taken a really deep dive into the UFO subject and brought to the attention not only the Australian public in many ways, but also a much broader public around the world kind of thing, because he's done well in terms of promoting this book, and there's been a number of news reports and documentaries that have evolved from this book. And the importance of what Ross Coulthard has done as an Australian journalist is that he's taken this deep dive into the UFO subject and highlighted a lot of the quite major UFO cases in Australia for a much broader audience. In particular, he's drawn a lot of attention to an area to the northwest of Australia, in Western Australia. And it's a very isolated area, but it's a place called Northwest Cape. And for many decades, it's been a US base. It's basically a series of large aerial arrays that provide a ultra low frequency radio network for US submarine fleets in India and the Pacific. It unfortunately makes Australia, or that particular area of Australia, a nuclear target in any kind of nuclear conflict. But amazingly, that area has become a bit of a focus for UFO activity. And I'd written about it in a publication called Omega Science Digest back in, I think it was the mid-80s, particularly one case that occurred there. And during the Middle East Yom Kippur War, where there was a lot of military activity going on in the Middle East, the base itself at Northwest Cape was put onto a full nuclear alert. It went to DEFCON 3, which is the highest peacetime military alert for any kind of forces. And that alert was issued from Northwest Cape in October of 1973. The problem for the Australian government was that the Prime Minister of Australia at that time, Gough Whitlam, they weren't notified, and that caused a lot of angst between Australian and American authorities. And the Prime Minister of Australia at the time kind of basically said that US bases in Australia were no longer sacrosanct, or were no longer going to be absolutely that their continuing existence in Australia were going to be always an easy deal. It was going to become a matter of public debate. And a lot of people kind of thought that led to a lot of, how shall I say, covert political activity that might have destabilised the Australian government. And as it turned out, the Whitlam government was dismissed by our own local Governor-General in 1975. And there's a lot of kind of conspiracy theories, that kind of thing around it. But the interesting thing from the UFO kind of interested parties is that on the same evening as the full nuclear alert was issued from Northwest Cape, the base itself, there was a UFO sighting from that base, and the lieutenant commander of the base, Commander Moya or Meyer, we're not quite certain the spelling of his name, and independently a fire captain, an Australian fire captain on the base, both observed a Saturn-shaped large dark object hovering above Mount Athol, which is just to the west on the Indian Ocean side. And it was observed hovering there and then took off at phenomenal speed. Now, both witnesses were quite experienced, and neither of them were in a position to connect it or identify it with anything that was man-made, so to speak. And when it's coming from the lieutenant commander of the base, an American official, and an Australian fire captain on the base, it's a pretty impressive sighting. And that the actual government file on that case became available to a researcher associated with my group here in Sydney. And it was quite unprecedented that case became available. But nevertheless, we were able to confirm that, yes, it was a legitimate UFO case, and that we documented it publicly. And I wrote an article for a publication called Mega Science Digest that highlighted that this one case had major national security implications for Australia, particularly when it's occurring on the same day as Australian soil is used to issue a full nuclear alert to American forces in the region. So it became a bit of a political hot potato. Now, Ross Coulthard, in his book In Plain Sight, has updated the Northwest Cape saga by highlighting the fact that there are a lot of sightings in that general area around Northwest Cape, Exmouth, which is the local support town near Northwest Cape. So there's been a lot of major cases reported in that area. And I guess also from an Australian point of view, his journalistic activities have highlighted particularly one of the stronger cases, which was a bit of a sleeper case, and that's the Westall school case from 1966. Now, that's going back quite a way, and it also dovetails in with the beginnings of my kind of initial interest as a young teenager. But that case is incredibly important, and I guess you would call it a sleeper case because it got a whisper of publicity at the time that occurred in April of 1966. And Westall was a little outer suburban kind of area in Melbourne, in Victoria, Australia. And this was a daylight, multiple witness sighting. Hundreds of school kids, teachers, locals, all witnessed this, an object that apparently landed in a nearby area called the Grange at Westall. And there were many, many witnesses, a very, very impressive sighting, physical evidence, trace marks at the site. And also the case highlights the heavy hand of the military, in which basically the military were, or somebody, either the US forces or Australian military, were involved in telling most of the witnesses to shut up about this case. It was a quite an extraordinary case.
And one of the best. Yeah, we're talking about Westall, and someone said that there was a collective illusion, but the witness saw something, and they saw as well some airplanes chasing that UFO. Is that true?
Yes, yeah. I've talked to many of the witnesses at Westall, and one of the most impressive witnesses for me was a young bloke called Victor. Now, he was just a school kid, and he was amongst the group that went across to a nearby fence adjacent to the school, and there were, by the time he got there, and this was what was called a recess period, early morning, or around about 11 o'clock in the morning, and dozens of school children and one or two teachers were on the school grounds and had congregated along the fence line. When Victor got there, he looks over the fence and sees at least two other school kids, boys, standing near what appeared to be two objects, quite large objects in the sense of around about 20 to 30 feet in diameter, hovering just above the ground, literally a foot or two off the ground. And he then decides to climb over the fence and join the two kids that were standing there next to these two objects. And he could remember hearing a school teacher telling him, "Do not go over the fence. Do not go over the fence." Basically, he decided he was going over the fence because he wanted to get up close to this object. He climbs over the fence, walks up to it, and he got so close that he was thinking about touching the object, but then could feel heat and decided best not to touch it. At that point, the two objects then rose up, and one of them went up, and there was a Cessna, a light Cessna aircraft passing overhead at that time. This object goes up, orbits the Cessna aircraft, and then takes off off in the distance. The other object rose up and then went down into what's called the Market Gardens area, the Grange. This is a location that was very popular with the school kids, and appears to have landed in the Grange. Now, when that happened, as recess starts for the school, all the kids come out of the school class, and then there's a whole flood of school children rushing to where Victor was, but also over to the Grange area where the other UFO was seen to have landed. And the reports are that dozens and dozens of school children went down to that location. And that's where it gets really unusual. You know, like over the decades, in particular, Shane Ryan, a Canberra-based teacher, had undertaken a study. He's focused almost entirely on the Westall school case and runs a really good website, the Westall 1966 UFO case, or flying saucer case. And collectively, I think there's been over close to 200 people interviewed that have had an involvement in this case. These are school children, teachers, members of the general public, all have been involved in this case. So it's one of the best documented and witnessed cases in Australia, and it's certainly dominating a lot of attention at the moment. Strikingly, one of the things that's interesting is that with Ross Coulthard's involvement, he's been able to open it up a little bit further as well, because it turns out that one of his contacts in government turned out to be the son of the person that apparently was charged with writing a secret report on this case. Now, unfortunately, we still, to the best of my knowledge, we haven't seen the actual document, but that's been the subject of a lot of activity in terms of trying to locate that information. And there's also, apparently, that case is once again going to become the focus of yet another primetime TV documentary that Ross has produced, and that's actually airing on Australian television tonight. So it should be interesting to see that. So I've had a bit of limited contact with Ross in the last day or so. He's been tied up putting the finishing touches to that documentary. So it sounds like it'll be an interesting update on the previous documentary that came out in about July, at the same time as his book. So it's done well in terms of publicity for his book, but I do highly recommend his book to your listeners, and simply because it's a very good investigative kind of dive into the complexity of the UFO mystery, and it does a lot of work on the American scene, all the current information, the debates and claims and all that kind of stuff. So it's a great way of getting through the complexity of what's going on in the UFO field today.
That's great. I think that the case much known here in Brazil is the Frederick Valentich disappear.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about this case? Was an alien abduction? Was a aircraft crash? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I'd like to be absolutely certain in terms of being able to give you an answer, but that single case is so complicated. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of having Frederick available to interview. He disappeared on that day back in October in 1978. He's a young learner pilot. He was quite well liked in terms of his pilot training. He was involved in doing a night flying trip across to a place called King Island. And that King Island is situated in the big strait of water that separates Victoria, or mainland Australia, from our island state, and that is Tasmania, to the south. And Bass Strait has had a long history of unusual events, some of them UFO related, that kind of thing. But on this particular occasion in October of 1978, here's Fred Valentich flying across, doing a routine kind of flight, and just during that flight that he has, he reports to Moorabbin, which is the airport that he flew out of, and the air traffic control were monitoring the conversation, and I've had the opportunity to listen to that conversation, and it's quite a remarkable kind of conversation, but it seems to imply that he had an encounter mid-air with a UFO, and at the end of that conversation there's a repeating kind of noise like the knocking of a microphone or metal on metal, that kind of thing. And at the end of that 6-minute recorded conversation, Valentich is nowhere to be found. There was a huge air and sea search, and the pilot and the plane have never been found. There's a possibility of one small piece of wreckage that may or may not have been related to the aircraft, but even that is ambiguous. So essentially we've still got the situation that decades later we've got no evidence to confirm a simple explanation for this story. Fortunately, over the last decade or so, the official files have become available. We've been able to examine all that. And the problem with this case is there are so many conflicting elements to it that it's hard to be absolutely certain what took place. But in my dealings with the case, I should point out that I was actually on a road trip at the time, driving up from Sydney to my old hometown of Grafton on the north coast of New South Wales, heading up to Queensland to a UFO flap area. That area was called St. George. It's out in country Queensland near the New South Wales border, fairly remote area. But it had repeat activity. And I was sort of halfway up to Grafton when I was getting phone calls and media information. We heard about reports on the news that there were reports of a missing plane over Bass Strait. I started to make some phone calls to contacts that I had, and I was being advised that something pretty extraordinary was taking place, and that it was apparently UFO related. So I decided to turn back to Sydney, and the next 5 days were absolutely insane. There were literally thousands thousands and thousands of media inquiries, that kind of stuff. This case became a worldwide media sensation. But sadly, there's been no determination on what happened to Frederick Valentich and his plane. So it still remains an unexplained mystery. There's been suggestions that maybe he staged a suicide or whatever. There were suggestions that he was failing his pilot tests and not doing well in his pilot exams, that kind of thing. But the general thrust of pilot training here in Australia, is, back in those days and even today, is that if you were failing your exams, that wasn't necessarily a problem. You just keep at it until you finally pass. So the implication that basically Valentich faked the experience isn't well founded. So it's kind of one of those ongoing mysteries. And I've certainly done a lot of quite unusual investigations into this case. One of the most bizarre ones was when we were advised of the possibility that a farmer was involved in witnessing a UFO that apparently occurred on the same day or the same evening as Frederick's sort of mystery flight. And the implication of that farmer story was that he's out doing night ploughing, and this is in South Australia, which is adjacent to Victoria, and claims that he was having trouble with his tractor. He then checks the tractor, gets off the tractor's still running, finds that he's in complete shadow, and looks up, and there's this massive object directly above him, and he kind of starts to freak out, thinking that this object's going to come down on top of him. But the most bizarre element of the whole story is that he claims that he sees a Cessna aircraft hanging off the side of the UFO. And he scratches down on the bonnet of the tractor the call sign of the aircraft that he can see hanging off the side of the UFO. It's a really bizarre story. And myself and a mate of mine in Victoria, George Simpson, we've been sort of trying to pursue this story for quite a while. And we're still... It's a very complicated story, but the implication was that perhaps there was some pretty extraordinary elements to the Frederick Valentich story that still remain to be resolved even after all this time. So it's one of the other major UFO mysteries of Australia.
I think it's going to be forever unsolved mystery, because I think we're never going to get an answer. But my friend, you wrote a book, this book, Hair of the Alien.
Right.
And the DNA and other forensic evidence of an alien abduction. And this book is a report investigation into the Peter Curry case. Can you tell us about this case?
Well, the Peter Curry story, it's a really amazing story. And, obviously I recommend people read the book Here of the Alien, but also go to a site that I've got called the Alien DNA Paradigm. That's linked in with my main website, my blog site, the Ozfiles. So if you go to the ozfiles.blogspot.com, you'll see a link to the right there to a number of other sites that I've got. One of them is the Alien DNA Paradigm site. Now, I've called it that because, in particular, because of the Peter Curry case, that led me to do a very detailed kind of scientific forensic investigation of this case. Now, I've always been an advocate over the decades of open scientific inquiry, and obviously I think we can all agree that the alien abduction subject is one of the most controversial aspects of the whole UFO subject. And it's been a matter of ongoing debate for decades. And it was particularly because of that I was always on the lookout for cases that involve hard physical evidence. Now, in alien abduction stories, that's very difficult to get hold of. Now, we've got the controversial claims of implants and all sorts of other things, but in Peter Curry's case, there was something rather different, and that was a biological sample. And this was a hair sample. Now, that's why the book has become, got the name of Hair of the Alien. That was my publisher's kind of choice of name, which I finally went with. And essentially what it revolves around is that Peter Curry was a young man who had emigrated with his family from Lebanon. He has a Christian Maronite background. He had lived in Australia for a couple of decades at the time, or about a decade, I think, at the time of this experience. He had had some unusual UFO experiences with his girlfriend. They'd witnessed a couple of odd UFO events, but nothing that really drew them into the UFO subject. But it was this experience in 1988 where he has like a classic kind of alien abduction experience. And in part, his brother and father are kind of like borderline witnesses to that experience. He's staying at home at that point. He'd been a bit of a prodigal son returning to the family home, and was had a room in the house. He was asked by his brother to, they were all watching TV, and his brother asked him, can he watch the TV program in his own room so that he could watch this other program with his father. Peter does that. He goes to the bedroom, and then almost immediately has this experience of encountering these grey type beings, almost a classic kind of alien abduction experience. Now, but the problem, the brother and the father seem to be shut off this kind of classic kind of experience that seems to occur. But Peter was an extraordinarily profound and life-changing experience. He claims that one of the beings put a needle into his head, and he loses consciousness and wakes up and has this classic experience. But it was another experience. Like a lot of people that have these experiences, there's more than one experience involved. And I got to know Peter. He spent a long time trying to understand what was going on. He wasn't really even that interested in the UFO subject, and by our standards, I guess, was completely uninformed about the UFO subject. And so he seeks out a local UFO group and becomes a member of that organisation, and eventually was through that connection and other connections that he finally makes contact with me. And it was only later on, much later, that I learned of an experience that occurred in 1992, and this is what becomes the subject of the book Hair of the Alien, where he had an experience, and by that stage he was struggling so much trying to understand his own experience in 1988. He had formed, he went a long way in terms of forming his own kind of abduction support group. Now, a lot of people struggle with their own experiences. Peter went a long way with establishing a pretty impressive support group that basically had a number of health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists associated with it, scientists. I was an informal member of it as well. But there was one experience that he had that he was even reluctant to share with members of his own group, and this is the experience in 1992. Now, I accidentally found out about this when a number of years later he's talking to some production people involved with a UFO documentary, and they were interested in physical evidence, and that's when he goes to a filing cabinet, and I happened to be in his place at the time, and he pulls out this plastic bag that had hair samples in it. And I'm listening with great interest. What the hell is he talking about here? And he starts to describe this experience of alien abduction. And that was the beginning of the investigation. Turns out that he'd had an experience with the two beings. The complication here was that he was off work at the time. He had been assaulted on a job site. There were a couple of people trying to steal some of his building equipment. He was working as a building contractor, and people were trying to steal some of his equipment. He's assaulted, hit and injured severely on the head. So he was out of work at that time, recovering from very severe injuries. And his wife was the only breadwinner of the family. Now, he was under medication, and I'll point out the medication was not of a type that created hallucinations, particularly hallucinations about being abducted by aliens. And the thing that I have to keep reminding skeptics of is that, sure, one could come up with all sorts of possible explanations, but you have to be able to explain the hair sample and the complexity of the results that we got from this. But to cut a long story short, I won't get into the controversial detail. I recommend people read the story or look at the website. But he has this bizarre experience with two beings that appear inside his house. There seems to be a sexual connotation, but nothing that he can explicitly remember. But one of the beings, it appears to be a tall, extremely strong blonde being. Now, for those of you, for your audience in Brazil, I could see, with the benefit of a deep knowledge of UFO history, kind of parallels to the Antonio Villaboas case from the late 1950s. And this was obviously Brazilians know the case, and the parallels with Peter Curie's experience are interesting. But the parallels that I was interested in were not well known, even to a lot of Brazilian researchers. And this was the significance of certain anatomical details like bright orange hair under the arm and that kind of stuff in other parts of this person's body. And that becomes a major factor in the investigation, because when we investigated Peter Curie's case, he had these hair samples, and we decided, let's apply heavy-duty DNA forensic techniques to this, kind of a CSI or criminal science investigation, a forensic investigation using DNA techniques to this biological hair sample and see where it goes. Now, this was a big risk to Peter personally, because I said, if this sample comes out entirely prosaic or straightforward, nothing unusual, then he'd have a lot of explaining to do, particularly to his own wife. She was very supportive of him. And as it turned out, I was being assisted in this investigation by one of the chief research scientists for the government science organisation that's called the CSIRO. And at the time, I couldn't name the scientist involved, a biochemist, but he's now gone public, and that's Dr. Horace Drew. He was the co-author of a major university-level textbook on understanding DNA. So he's certainly a well-credentialed, respected scientist in the DNA field. And he was the one that was the primary kind of organiser of the scientific investigation into the hair sample that Peter Curie recovered from this alien abduction experience. Now, if it had been an ordinary piece of hair, we would probably be not having this conversation. But as it turned out, the hair sample was quite strange. It appeared to be a optically transparent hair sample. The initial investigation of the shaft of the hair highlighted that we were dealing with something that appeared to have a rare Asian mongoloid DNA profile present in it. And this was sort of somewhat inexplicable because we're dealing with a blonde hair sample, and the profile of the DNA that we're getting suggested it should have been a black hair sample. And it appeared to be coming from this blonde-haired, Nordic-looking woman that Peter had encountered in his 92 experience. And the complication that becomes even more bizarre is that we were able to then examine the nucleus of the hair sample, the root, and that highlighted a different set of DNA profiles. What appeared to particularly to be prominent was a rare Basque garlic DNA profile. Now, that in itself was a rather strange DNA anomaly because depending where you take your samples from a person, whatever, blood, skin, hair, whatever, the DNA should be all the same and you get consistent profiles. But here we were getting different DNA in the shaft as compared to the root of the sample. And what the DNA specialists were telling me was that this appeared to support the idea that we were dealing with a kind of a cloned hair sample, well, for want of a better word, and this has all sorts of connotations in the UFO field, it appeared to be a hybrid hair sample. And depending on where you took your DNA sampling, the root or the shaft, you'd get two different types of DNA. And the scientists involved were really taken aback by this. They were amazed. And the problem we had, of course, is that we only had the one sample. And unfortunately, we don't get many samples like this. And this is one of the things, the main focus of the book, as far as I'm concerned, is this is a case study. It's a kind of an alert to everybody out there that this is the kind of work that we should be routinely doing. But even though this book was published back in 2005, it's still not routine. There's thousands of claims of alien abduction cases out there, but very little in the way of well-documented DNA studies. And this is this was literally the first of its kind in the public domain, where a biological sample from an alien abduction case came up with some pretty unusual results. And that led me to do some rather extraordinary investigations. And one of the things that really interested us was, what is this rare Asian mongoloid DNA profile? And it was that particular part of the investigation that took me to Thailand and China, where we were able to make a good correlation with the idea that the DNA profiles correlated with a rare ethnic group or an isolated ethnic group called the Lahu. And this is a mountain tribe of indigenous people that were mainly located in northern Thailand, Laos, and southwest China. And I was able to personally go to those locations and conduct field research with the Lahu people, both in northern Thailand and also in southwestern China, in Yunnan province. And what was amazing, and this is why I refer people to my Alien DNA Paradigm blog site, because that brings in the hypothesis that the Peter Curie case really supports in an extraordinary way, and that is this suggestion that alien abductions are something to do with manipulating or examining our DNA. And it's no more evident, it's very strongly evident in this Lahu connection, because when we visited the Lahu, we found that they had a very well documented sky law, in the sense of sky beings or sky gods. And there were some pretty extraordinary things going on there in Lahu territory in southwestern China when I visited. Actually, I think it was about 2 weeks after I visited the Lahu in southwestern Yunnan province in China, there was a major UFO flap in that location. And a lot of locals in the Lahu territory were witnessing UFOs. So I found that fascinating. I wished I'd stayed another 2 weeks in that location. It would have been fascinating. But Chinese researchers were passing on that data to me, that a number of local officials, Communist Party officials and local tribes people were all witnessing UFO sightings in the Lahu territory about 2 weeks after I'd been in that location. So pretty interesting and compelling kind of confirmation.
Yes, indeed. And if the listeners and the audience want to know more about this case, this book is available on amazon.com.br. You can buy it. It's a great book. It's not thick, but it's in English, but it's a very good. And you can also find in the Ozzy Files blog spot that I'm going to leave all the links below in the video description.
Yeah, I just sort of encourage people to do the hard yards. Don't just go with a superficial kind of examination of the book and the data associated with it. Really focus on the detailed implications of what this is about, because it kind of encouraged me to look more widely at this whole kind of situation, what I call the alien DNA paradigm. That is, cultures around the world, particularly with ethnic tribal people that seem to have ongoing contact, amazing UFO connection with their belief systems and that kind of stuff in various remote locations around the world. And we keep finding this. It's all over the world and heavily linked into shamanic kind of cultures where shamans and stuff like that have contact with sky beings, that kind of thing. So it's a very kind of potent area of investigation. And actually, for those that online or there's a magazine, actually I should describe it. There's a new, I don't know whether you folks, you could probably get it online as PDF files, a publication called New Dawn magazine. And in that publication, in 2 parts, I've updated an article that I wrote way back in the early 90s for a Nature and Health publication. And it was basically called UFOs, the Shamanic Perspective. And it was really examining alien abductions from a shamanic point of view. Now, I know Brazil and many other countries within South America have very impressive ongoing kind of shamanic connections, or tribal shamans. And it's fascinating to see what appears to be an ongoing kind of UFO correlation in a lot of those cultures. And in this 2-part article in New Dawn, I update the this article that I wrote back in the 1990s, and I'll give you a quick indication. Here we go. This is part 2 of the article, and it gets into examining shamanic cultures, but also the connection with alien abduction experiences as well, in quite a lot of extraordinary detail. In fact, I do highlight the Lahu story in that, and also some pretty amazing kind of stories. For example, that little mountain that looks like Ayers Rock off in the distance, or Uluru, is actually near Burke in Western New South Wales, and it's referred to by the local Aborigines as Ubu Ubu, but it's called Mount Oxley, and that particular location was the gathering point of the tribal shamans around what's now known as Burke. And I've camped there myself, and an anthropologist from Europe who was studying and doing lecture work at one of the Australian universities contacted me about an unusual photograph that he'd taken with a tribal member on Mount Oxley. And that photograph showed an unusual, almost like a vortex thing up in the sky directly above what appeared to be like a crater of broken stones. Now, I was aware of that location because I'd been to the site, and that area is kind of huge tribal significance to local Aborigines. So most of the Aborigines won't go there at night time. It's only reserved for what they refer to as the Wurrens, or the tribal shamans, that would go to that location, and they would converse and go up into the sky to meet the sky being Bayami. So it's a very complicated kind of tribal belief concept, but to have it almost in a modern way highlighted and reconfirmed via this unusual photograph that was taken on Mount Oxley that shows this sort of aerial anomaly is quite startling. And if you're ever out in remote country, and a lot of people don't appreciate how big Australia is and how dry the centre of Australia is, but once you get out to Bourke in Western New South Wales, you're literally on the edge of what we call the outback. And from that point on, the further west you go into the heart of Australia, the drier it becomes. And it's a pretty intense kind of area, and a fascinating area to visit. And certainly the middle of Australia, Uluru, is a very popular tourist destination, but places like Bourke and others offer very similar kinds of tourist interests. And for me, it was a very interesting area from a UFO point of view because of some of the investigations I was doing there. As it turned out, the Bourke location was the location of a UFO crash story near Bourke that was passed on to me courtesy of local Aborigines. A very intriguing area to investigate.
Yes, Labor, there's a famous case there. But to finish our interview, my friend, the Australian Parliament recently discussed the UFO phenomena. The military said they don't have a program to investigate UFOs.
Yep.
Do you believe that?
Yep. Well, yeah, I was pretty underwhelmed by that statement, but it was the circumstances by which that came into the public domain. Now, we have what's called Senate estimate committees and that kind of stuff, and it's an opportunity for Parliament or politicians to question various activities and provide or to have dialogue with the government in power. And on this particular occasion, a Green Senate member from Tasmania put the question to, as it turned out, the Chief of the Royal Australian Air Force, the Chief of Staff, and asked the question and brought to the Chief's attention the UAP report that had come out of Washington through the Defence Intelligence Community in Washington about the UAP task force. Now, amazingly, it appeared that the chief was not very well briefed about this, claimed that there was no UAP task force group operating in Australia. The evidence seems to be to the contrary, and we're really looking at this in a lot of detail. The Green senator was actually inspired to ask this question because a friend of his was a member of the Special Air Services. This is like the elite commando group, and apparently his friend 20 years earlier had been out at sea on a ship or some sort of watercraft, and he and the SAS team apparently encountered a UFO, something that was very similar to the so-called popularised term Tic Tac, a large object that this SAS group had encountered. Now, the details of this experience haven't been spelled out quite yet, but we're sort of working towards getting information about that. But the important thing in this parliamentary statement was that the RWF Chief of Defence, the RWF guy, said that there was no unit involved in doing this, and that his only past recollection was a case from nearly 40 years ago. And what he was referring to was a radar situation where radar systems near Sydney were picking up UFOs repeatedly. And this became quite a media sensation at the time. But the irony is that we know of many cases from the military, even involving SAS or Special Air Service elite troops having encounters once again out near Northwest Cape into the late 1980s and into the 90s. And we've got numerous cases that we know of that clearly indicate that our own military have had UFO experiences. And so it's quite a contradiction to have that statement from the Australian Defence Department. And it's certainly out of kilter with the statements that are coming out of the American military and the American Senate, because we all know that there's a lot going on at the moment in terms of the mainstream American political and military kind of embrace of UAPs and UFOs and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot going on to take on board.
That's great. My friend, we are running out of time, so I'd like to thank you very much for your time to be here. The Brazilian listeners and the audience are going to know you much more now. And as I said, I will leave all the links for your website and the blog and the Facebook and link to buy your book in the description of the video. Once again, thank you very much for your time, my friend.
And thank you for the time to share a bit of information about the Australian UFO scene to everybody in Brazil. Much obliged.
Thank you. É isso, pessoal. Espero que vocês tenham gostado dessa entrevista com Bill Chalker. Vocês ficaram conhecendo um pouco mais da ufologia na Austrália, casos interessantes, DNA extraterrestre. O que vocês acham? Espero que vocês tenham todos gostado. Não se esqueçam, compartilhem o canal, se inscrevam, espalhem o canal para todo mundo. Quanto mais gente, melhor. Um abraço para todos e até a próxima.